Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Henry Hips. I am the Deputy Director of the Education Program at the Gates Foundation and cannot be more excited about our opportunity to do a fireside chat with Bob Moses, an icon of the civil rights movement. As you have seen, there's an icebreaker poll with the audience that we've provided and have a few key questions. We'll give you a quick moment to take a look at that and please respond, as that'll help guide the rest of our conversation together. I'll also mention that this session will be recorded and also placed on the Balance the Equation Algebra 1 Grand Challenge website after this conversation is over. So let me give that one quick moment. Please go ahead and complete that. All right, team, thank you. We'll go ahead and pull that poll down and use some of that to guide the rest of this exciting conversation. Again, I'm Henry Hips. I am Deputy Director on the K-12 Education Program at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Particularly today, it makes me excited to talk to Bob Moses, who honestly in my own journey in education has been critical in my formation and thinking about my approach to the work. Bob Moses was born and raised in Harlem, New York. He directed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's Mississippi Voter Registration Project from 1961 to 64. He was also co-director of the Council of Federated Organizations. In addition to that, he was the lead organizer for the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer Project. Beyond that, he's been a deeply experienced mathematician, beginning in teaching mathematics in Tanzania and then returning back to the United States to enter his doctoral program in philosophy at Harvard. He was awarded a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship in 1982 through 1987, using that fellowship to launch the Algebra 1 or the Algebra Project, which uses mathematics as an organizing tool for quality education for all children in America. And with that support, the Algebra Project has worked with middle and high school students who've previously performed in the lowest quartile on standardized exams, and really proposing that they attain a high school math benchmark, graduating on time in 4 years and ready to do college math for college credit. He's also the co-author of a book, Radical Equations, Civil Rights from Mississippi to the Algebra Project, which he co-wrote with Charles E. Cobb, and has numerous accolades to his name with honorary doctorate degrees, which are captured in his bio on the algebra.org website for the Algebra Project. So with that, and particularly now, this question of the Algebra 1 Grand Challenge and why the Gates Foundation is focused on it. Without question, Algebra 1 has been a gatekeeper course historically in American education in ways that track students and remove opportunities for them later in their educational and ultimately in their career lives. And we know that students that do not have an opportunity to complete algebra have about a 1 in 5 chance of graduating from high school. But beyond that relatively low bar of graduating from high school, we also know that they are tracked out of the types of courses that are critical to their post-secondary going and success, and ultimately locked out of careers that are focused on STEM subjects, and moreover, are missing a key part of their opportunity to develop as a citizen and understanding and mastering algebra. Given that, and given this moment, the Gates Foundation team has worked deeply with educators, practitioners, researchers, and others in the field to craft the first Grand Challenge in the United States on behalf of the foundation. And this Grand Challenge structure is a really powerful and engaging one, where the entire point is to pose a really complex challenge in ways that invite the entire world to come together with multidisciplinary approaches with teams that pull from ideas from different sectors in order to focus attention on the challenge at hand. And in this challenge, it is very specifically around Algebra 1 outcomes for Black students, Latino students, and those students impacted by poverty. And so many of you have joined out of interest for that grand challenge. We have information about the grand challenge that we'll share in the chat, and encourage anyone who has opened up applications to complete those, and those who have maybe not had an opportunity to begin theirs to go ahead and get that open and apply, as tomorrow is the closing date for those RFPs. And I left out one of the most critically important parts, which is that phase one, those planning grants are on the order of $100,000 each, and folks that get to that level are then eligible for up to $1 million grant with research support. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and engage Bob with our first question. And given the current context and the current political context and what we understand, what you understand about education and civil rights, why does this moment matter now?
Yes, thanks, Henry. So we're in the midst of a presidential election. We're wrestling across the nation with existential questions. Who are we? Where have we come from? Where are we headed? These existential questions have emerged like clockwork, roughly every 3/4 of a century. First, at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which solidified the nation as both freedom saturated and African slave capitalized. Second, during Reconstruction from 1865 to 1875, these questions emerged, after which freed Africans became a citizen caste, denied voting rights and education opportunity structures. And then you fast forward to World War II, and after World War II, the Houston Marshall Legal Defense Fund team extracted a curious phrase, all deliberate speed, from the Warren Supreme Court in the Brown decision designed to overturn Plessy, separate but equal. After all of that, followed the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s.
And Bob, I mean, given your deep involvement and not even just involvement, but the fact that you were a key architect of the civil rights era that you just mentioned, and the fact that you've had a long career in teaching mathematics, why is algebra so critical? And how would you challenge the way algebra is taught today, given that broader context you just shared?
Yeah, and the reason algebra is so critical is that it actually enters into these existential questions. Who are we as a nation? Where have we come from? And where are we headed? With respect to a very specific area, which is the need to have an educated citizenry. So what has happened is that the technology has shifted from the 20th century industrial technology to 21st century information technology. The 20th century industrial technology required at least a minimum reading and writing to to work in the factories and so forth. But you could go to college and say, well, I don't do math. And nobody would raise an eye, right? And then came the shift in technology to a technology which allows enormous amounts of data, including quantitative data, to enter into every area of society, the political, the cultural, so forth. But it now requires a different kind of education. So the education for factory work, the 20th century education for citizenship is not enough. What is needed now is an education for knowledge work, an education which includes not only the reading and writing literacies, but the quantitative literacies. In this country, algebra is kind of the doorway into the mathematics, right, needed to enter into the 21st century economic, political conversations and opportunities. So this is the critical issue. In some sense, math and mathematicians have been caught with their pants down. There's nothing in the training of a mathematician currently, right, even now, which says, well, you must prepare yourself to enter into the public conversation about the teaching and learning of math from before school all the way up through graduate school. That as a citizen now, as a public citizen, and as a person who has a special expertise, you have also a responsibility. Well, the country hasn't in any way entered into any conversation or afforded any kind of resources for the mathematics community as a whole, right? They have taken it up in bits and pieces, but there's been no national response, right? Which is what is needed. So here we are with mass incarceration. If you think back at those eras that I talked to you about, in the first era after the Constitutional Convention, right to the Civil War, the slaves were not in prison, right? You didn't park your property. You made money off of it, right? You insured it, right? You put it to work. And then after the Africans had been freed, they became commodities for particularly young Black men for the work that's needed on the plantations and in the coal mines all across the South, right? And so their education, if there was any education, I think of it as sharecropper education, particularly with regard to plantations. You are pre-assigned work, and so you get an education at best for the work you've been pre-assigned, right? And so that carries us right into this century. And the tragedy is, and we see it now in our political situation, which we are sitting on as we speak, where we have not agreed to actually shift the education focus for the needs of the 21st century and the information age technologies. The country has just not agreed to do that. It doesn't have the political will. It doesn't have a political party, which it can get behind a reconstruction of education, which abolishes this caste system, right? And also eliminates the need for mass incarceration, because whereas you didn't imprison African slaves, and then whereas you rounded up the young African men and put them in the mines to work and die, now you don't need them in any workforce if they can't reach the level needed, and so they're in prison. And so that whole mix, right? These are the existential questions that the country has to face, and math is a critical piece of that.
And part of what I hear you saying is some of the question is about resources and resource allocation, but fundamentally it's about mindset shift, both at the level of society, but also on an individual basis.
Yeah.
I want to come back. I'm going to ask you a question about youth voice and the power of youth in that context and shifting some of those mindsets. If you could think about that for one quick second, and I want to actually turn to the audience just to let folks know that we are going to be taking questions from the audience. So please begin to queue those up. Please put those in the Q&A function on Zoom as opposed to the chat. So please go ahead and click on the Q&A button that you'll see in your console and begin to load those questions up. And when we wrap up with this portion in about the next 15 minutes, we'll make sure we turn to the audience and pull in some of those questions. Thank you. So Bob, where we left off was you talking about this question of lack of commitment and mindset change. And given the role that you've played in facilitating and raising up youth voice, and how that's been at the center of this movement around math literacy, and there's kind of a through line between the work you've been doing with the Young People's Project all the way through some of the work that you're doing with the We the People Project, Math Literacy for All. And I wonder what you're hearing youth in today's context, seeing everything that they're seeing, what are they saying about what needs to change, and what do they see for themselves and their role in that?
Yes. So our biggest success has been creating the space for young people to own their own movement around math literacy. And that's the Young People's Project. And I learned that from the experience with SNCC and Ella. I watched as Ella created the space for the sit-in leaders to own their own movement. And we took that into Mississippi. And mind you, our mindset in Mississippi was we didn't really want to live in this country unless we could change it. So our mindset was, career doesn't matter, money doesn't really matter. What matters is, can we get a piece of this problem and actually work it, right? And so the piece that we were working on was voter registration. And the young people from the SNCC and CORE field secretaries were the energy, right, which attached to the sharecroppers, the Fannie Lou Hamers, to form the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, with the mindset that the National Democratic Party has to change, right? That this caste system, the caste system actually permeates the National Democratic Party. It has done so for almost a century, and that has to change. And so the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, led by Mrs. Hamer. Now that's another mindset which we got through Ella, which is that there's leadership in the people who have the problem. And if you don't try to usurp and become the leader, but act rather as an organizing uh, person who is going to help that leadership emerge, right? Then you won't get the leadership you need, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of what's happening with the young people that we work with in the math classes, right? Because the idea of leadership, it's not just this big broad thing. Oh, I'm a national leader and a national spokesman. It's it's are you a leader where you are on the ground, in the situation, in the math class? Can the students actually step up, right? I mean, math is notorious, right, for the teacher turning its back on the students and writing something on a board, right? Um, they don't do that now. There's some technology to put up there, but that doesn't change uh, that it's not the students that are helping to drive the conversation in the classroom, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the students who are doing that, um, they now they are now, whether they like it or not, they've got to drive the conversation in the nation as a whole about, well, where are we? Who are we? Where are we going? You know, um, these young people have to drive that conversation. They've got to begin it, and they've got to take it. And just demonstrating won't do it. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, demonstrating is kind of, it's reaction. You're on the defense. Somebody's done something you don't like, and so you go out and protest. That's okay, right? But it's not enough.
Mm.
What you've got
And
to do, yes.
along those lines, Bobby, I want to take you back to your earlier days um, when you were testing out different approaches to really tap into what students were bringing with them into their class. You were really innovative in how you thought about that, and it's one of the reasons you have been viewed as an innovator, and you won the MacArthur Genius Fellowship. But part of what you're talking about is kind of this connection to the actual content that makes the math real in ways that engage students in a different way. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about what brought you to that point and some of the techniques that you saw work, particularly when you were talking about Black and Brown and low income students that had traditionally been marginalized.
Yes, and it's really um, counterintuitive because what brought me to that point was studying under the star, if you want, of Harvard's philosophy department, Willard Van Orman Quine, in the 50s. And Quine was wrestling with a very abstract problem dealing with foundations of mathematics, and was saying, well, this just doesn't come out of thin air, right? And it actually is founded in the language that people speak. And what happens is that the language that people speak, thinking now at least of English, gets regimented, he said, for purposes of elementary arithmetic, elementary logic, and elementary set theory. What you have is the regimentation of what he called ordinary discourse, right? So I was thinking a lot about that as we began the algebra project, trying to wrestle with the issues of the kids had and their language and how do they access the language of math, right? And so we came up with the idea that, well, what Quine is talking about is that you have a sentence like, Jack is taller than Jimmy, right? And you know pretty much what you're talking about. You're not talking about their weight or their temperature. You're talking about their height, right? But the word height doesn't appear in the sentence. And Jack, Jimmy, and is taller than are not going to appear in any mathematical equations, right? So how does this sentence get transformed into something that, you know, gets mathematized, becomes a mathemat? And what Quine was saying was that, well, what you do is you regiment this sentence. And the regimentation in this case is that you make a name, right? Instead of Jack, you make a name, the height of Jack. Instead of Jimmy, you make another name, the height of Jimmy. Now, what are you going to do with this taller than? Well, it's taller than, you're not going to say the height of Jack and the height of Jimmy, those are numbers. You don't talk about numbers being taller than other numbers, right? Numbers are greater or less than other numbers. So you come out with a sentence that the height of Jack is greater than the height of Jimmy. And that's the sentence that can be mathematized. The kids can actually create such sentences, and they can make up their own symbols, right, for their new names, right? Because that's all mathematics does, right? It makes up symbols for names that it wants to actually recognize and use, right? So it's at that basic level, right? So we set out to look at, well, what experiences are such that the kids as a class or as a group can experience them, can write about them, can talk about them, can think about the features in the experience that they notice. Now, if you take kids on a trip and you ask them to write about it and say, what are the features of the trip? They're not likely to say, it started. They're not likely to say, there's a finish, right? These are too obvious to pay attention to, and that's part of the problem with math, right? It begins with things which are too obvious to pay attention to. And so the kids will talk about the mall they went to and all the exciting things they saw, right? But once they have gotten into the conversation about what they think are the important features, they're open to suggestions from you about what you think are features that can be mathematized, right? And so you get them on that road. You have to get them to the place where they are willing and to go and document an experience, either with a camera or a notebook, or whatever, right? Come back and talk to each other about, write about it, become part of a conversation about it, right? And see if they can reach consensus about it, right? So these are all attributes of knowledge work, right?
Mhm.
And that's what's needed, right? So it's not only just the involvement of the kids, it's showing them that this abstract subject called math has some concrete foundation, and you can access the abstract by developing tools among yourselves for looking at the concrete.
And Bob, I'm going to ask you one more question. We're going to pull some of these great questions from the audience, but you just described a really powerful way to engage students. And I know you've done a lot of work with teachers around professional development to actually help improve practice in this area. And that's a very specific mindset change. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the more promising approaches to actually helping move those adult mindsets about what students are capable of and how to actually create these more engaging and relevant
Yes.
experiences.
And I think we were working with a group of schools, elementary schools in Ohio, rural schools. What was interesting was that the elementary school teachers, grade 1, 2, 3, so forth, were really attracted to this way of looking at and approaching the math because they are trained in the language. They're not trained to teach the math, right? You know, you get your elementary certificate, your math is minimal, right? They're trained in the language. So using the language to access the math really turned out to be beneficial. Now, you can go all the way through middle school. Middle school teachers, you can get teachers in middle school who are really open to this approach once they get into it. And they don't have the obstacle of thinking, well, I am really a mathematician who knows how to do math and teach math. I've been doing it, you know, this way for years, and that's the way I'm going to do it, right? So you have a harder road to hoe as you go up, right? College is almost impossible, right? I mean, the college mathematicians are still wrestling with this. Um, it was amazing. I was on a tour with a college, a research mathematician who was going to college professors and holding workshops. And on the issue of the little equation, A minus B equals A plus the opposite of B, right? And what did they think that question or that statement, what was that statement? Most of them thought of it, well, it's a definition of subtraction, right? What you mean by A minus B is A plus the opposite of B. You try that with delta X and delta Y and linear equations, right? You have your subtraction sign there, right? But what you don't mean by that subtraction, y2 minus y1, that you're talking about adding the opposite of y1. So the very foundation, right, of which begins at the very beginning, once you introduce direction to number, right, then you have to shift your idea about addition, right? Because before, addition just meant, well, 2 plus 3 equals 5. Well, start at 2, jump 3 to the right. You ended at 5, right? But now, after you introduce direction into numbers, right? 2 plus negative 3, what does that mean, right? You know, subtraction, 5 minus 3 equals 2. Okay, so you start at 5, you move 2 to the left, or 3 to the left, and you get to 2. Now you come to subtraction where you have negative 5 minus negative 3. You know, what are you doing, right? So fundamental, right? Right back down to once you introduce direction into number, you're in a whole new ball game, and the metaphors have to change, right? The metaphor of takeaway for subtraction doesn't work, really. It's just a bad metaphor when you have direction in your numbers, right? Well, how are the kids gonna think about their metaphor? They're not taught to think about the metaphors that underline what they do and whether they're appropriate at this stage or that stage, right? So it's that level.
Now that makes a lot of sense, and I'm seeing by way of folks chiming in the chat that that's resonating with folks. I've already started pulling in some of the content from the Q&A, but let me ask another one from the audience. and this is connected clearly to your role at being an innovator, um, and also recognizing that there are no silver bullets. But given the context that you offered up around the importance of the information age, there are some questions around what do you think the role of technology is in terms of helping to think about innovation as kind of an equity imperative and actually playing a fundamentally different role here?
Yeah, yeah. So there's no doubt that there's going to be a huge role for technology. There is no doubt also that given the citizen caste system that has not been broached, and the country has given no inclination that it intends to break it up, that that will just the technology will just exacerbate that situation, right? And so the you can have the technology, um, you can have it to individualized. I mean, there's a whole movement going on to have wallets. Each student has its own wallet, which says everything they know, right? But students don't have the same access. So one student takes his wallet to the friend of his father, who's the CEO of some company or whatever. Another student has no idea where to take his wallet. Right? So the technology will not solve this problem, right? The technology will be there, yes, and people will use the technology, yes, but it will just exacerbate the problem, and it won't. You can defund every police department in the whole country, and if these kids don't have the proficiencies that are needed to access the economic arrangements, they are in jail, period.
Mm.
They are just in jail. You have assigned them to jail at grade 3, if you like, right?
Yep.
And you test them for whether they can read or not, right? So here we are as a country, um, you know, divided completely, right, with no idea, right, how to move forward. But who's going to raise the flag and say, look, we've got to have a conversation about this?
Mm. Well, on that, and you've been holding that flag and raising it for some time, and there's some folks that are here in this audience that are also flag bearers. Given that question of the intersection between policy and actually providing access and opportunity and politics, as we think about this next phase we're going to move into, uh, education policy is set by the states. What role can individual communities, and potentially, if there is will at a federal level, move forward to really shift some of these structural issues that you're referring to?
Yes. So was Plessy in education policy? Right. It certainly was set by the Supreme Court and gave the power to the states basically to forget about educating African Americans, right? And that went right down into the movement. I was on the witness stand in Greenville, Mississippi in the spring of 1963. Kennedy was still president. Burke Marshall sent John Doe down to be our lawyer. We had taken people down in Greenwood to register. They arrested SNCC people. Burke removed our cases to the federal district court. Judge Clayton had just one question for me. Why is SNCC taking illiterates down to register to vote? So sharecropper illiteracy was the subtext of the right to vote. And we took the position, well, somebody wants to go down and vote, Let them do whatever down there, sign their X, whatever. What they are expressing is their right, right? Their expression is their need to participate. And having denied them education through your politics, how are you going to turn around and say, well, they can't do politics because they're not educated, right? And mind you, the only literacies Judge Clayton was thinking about was reading and writing. Math wasn't even on the table, you know?
Mm. I hear you saying pretty clearly and repeatedly that there is no daylight between this question of how we think about broader policy, around broader structural challenges, and how that shows up in education. And we need to actually figure out how to address both together.
Yeah, and let me give you another example. In
Please.
1990, Tom Brokaw, right, master communicator, decided he was going to spend 4 months in Jackson, Mississippi, looking at this. He camped out at the near high school where we were doing the algebra project, right? Had been doing it now for 6 years. His major producers, whatever, were in my classroom, right? What did he do? He wrote an article that the New York Times said, isn't it so sad what's still going on? He's writing about a young Black kid who wants to be a basketball player, right? And gets caught up in street stuff, right? He's writing about a young girl who wants to be a doctor, but she gets caught up and becomes pregnant, right? He doesn't even mention the Algebra Project. I mean, here's a movement that's getting started under his nose, right? It's not in his, it's just nowhere near. He doesn't think it's real. I don't know what he thinks, you know, but it's indicative, right? That you can't, it's not just you people, you know, it's not just the racists, right? It's the whole liberal establishment.
Mm. So Bob, I want to just thank you for engaging us today, but also provide or give a really personal thank you. Again, discovering your work earlier in my career, reading your book was really formative for me, as I know it was for a lot of folks, and continuing to follow the powerful work you've been doing. We've got about a minute left, and given the audience that we have, collection of folks who are practitioners, researchers, other community members, innovators, builders of things, a lot of folks interested in this grand challenge and what you have to say. Given the context of the last couple of days and given the opportunity in front of us, I'd love for you to help close us out with 1 minute of what else you'd like to share.
Well, so we are a nation that lurches, right? And we have lurched forward and backwards, right? Civil War, lurch forward, Reconstruction, then lurch back. Civil rights movement, lurch forward, and here we are. Right? And we lurch every so, I don't know, 3/4 of a century, right? So we are going to lurch. And the question is, are there forces in the country that actually can help the country lurch forward, right, around these fundamental constitutional questions of the preamble? Who are we, right? Who are the people? What's the denotation? Who are the people of the preamble? From white men with property owners, right, to where we are now, we have, you know, gone back and forth about, well, who are the people of the preamble? So this fundamental question because it's tied to, well, what's the common good for all these people, right? That's what the preamble talks about, we the people, right? And then there's a whole list of uh, common goods, right, leading to ordain and establish the Constitution. Right?
I so appreciate that. The wisdom of having lived through and driven some of those movements, and the question of a nation that lurches. I know for me and for a lot of folks, that was a word we needed right now, one of motivation, one of balm, but also one that is deeply practical in its level of motivation. We really appreciate you, Bob. Thank you for all that you've been doing. Thank you for the inspiration for our collective work. And again, I appreciate the time for everyone on the call. In closing, want to remind folks that the Algebra 1 Grand Challenge closes tomorrow, November 6th at noon Pacific time. And we're excited to see the types of proposals that we get. And with that, I wish everyone safety and peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.